Welcome to our AJA Lunchtime Live. Today we're talking Prison Animal Farms Exposed. We have Kelvin Neufeld from Evolve Our Prison Farms and Onyx Helper from the Raven Corps here. I want to welcome all of you wonderful beings who are here live with us, and then welcome to those of you who are watching the replay. We appreciate your time. So we're going to find out more about these harmful industrial animal farm programs in the prison systems in both Canada and the US and what can be done. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about both of our guests here. We're going to have Kelvin just come up with me first, and then we're going to bring up Onyx, but I just want to introduce them. They're in the corner of the Zoom screen. First of all, Onyx Helper is a youth activist working as the Raven Corps campaign coordinator. They have been vegan for 4 years and an activist for 2. Onyx's major focuses as an activist are animal liberation efforts, and they are also quite active in human liberation struggles such as the Palestinian liberation movement. They're currently studying philosophy at SUNY Cortland, but you can also catch Onyx at a local fur protest. And we will be bringing Onyx partway through the convo on, but we're going to start picking the brain of Kelvin Neufeld. So let me tell you about Kelvin. Kelvin is a full-time social justice advocate, writer, and researcher. In 2016, Kelvin founded Evolve Our Prison Farms, a campaign to protect against the exploitation of animals and incarcerated persons in Canada's new prison farm program. Through investigative research, a lot of investigative research, and the publication of reports, this is how Kelvin has been doing a lot of his campaign work. Prior to founding Evolve, Kelvin worked as a legal researcher and as an executive assistant with the former Ontario Ministry of Research and Innovation. Kelvin lives with his wife and 11-year-old son in Perth, Ontario. Kelvin, welcome.
Thank you.
So good to see you, my friend.
It's very good to be here, Kimberly.
You know, I want to remind folks, anybody who's been with AJA since the beginning, you were on one of the panels in the very first 6 weeks that we launched, and we were your action at Evolve Our Prison Farms ended up being one of our first big collective actions. So you remember that?
Absolutely. It was wonderful. The impact was significant. And I look forward to talking about what impact it did have and why we need more.
Yes, absolutely. Well, okay. So for those uninitiated, first of all, tell us about Evolve Our Prison Farms and how this program originated.
Well, like you said, we founded it in 2016. So the background being that prison farms existed in Canada since, pre-colonial or colonial days, really, from the start of colonial days in Canada, and the introduction of prisons and the need to produce food to sustain prisons, which were often located in rural areas, and the need to be self-sustaining. And by adding animal agriculture to the farms, it allowed for the land to be expanded. By the state's own rules, they then acquired the lands around the prisons for the state use. So there's a real colonial history and origins to prison farms in Canada. And so it's a bit of a shameful history behind the origins, but all throughout, a century or so of prison farms, they fed prisons. And then in 2009, the Harper Conservative government began the process of closing prison farms because they cost too much money. And there were food quality and safety issues and accidents and injuries and all manner of problems with it. And they didn't lead to jobs for people leaving the penitentiary system. Right. And so they were all phased out by 2011, and that sparked some opposition, particularly in Kingston, Ontario, which is considered the penitentiary capital of Canada. They've got many, many prisons in Kingston. But the opposition was led by farmer groups who were primarily concerned with the closure of the last prison abattoir in Canada. The Correctional Service of Canada had phased out all other prison abattoirs that used to slaughter and produce meat for prisons. But the one in Kingston had been commercialized long before under CORCAN. So CORCAN is a subset of the Correctional Service of Canada. It is a special operating agency responsible for running prison industries in Canada. And all prison industries in Canada have been used to produce goods for internal use. For prisons, sale to CSC, selling the food from prison farms, to Correctional Service of Canada, CSC, or making mailbox for Canada Post, or uniforms for the military, or refurbishing vehicles for the military. But all industries in Canada have been for internal government purposes, almost exclusively. But the farmers in Kingston didn't want to lose access to the abattoir that they had gained access to as part of this public-private partnership that CorCan was experimenting with in the 1990s. And once they had become economically dependent on accessing the abattoir, which at the time still produced meat for prisons, but allowed a private sector operator to sell the higher priced meats commercially. So it was a bit of a profit-sharing relationship. So that sparked opposition to closing the farms because they didn't want to lose the abattoir. And the meat and dairy industries are very powerful, very influential in Canada, and they were successful in convincing the government to not close the abattoir that was slated for closure along with the farms. But they were unsuccessful in closing the farms. Now, they argued that the farms are good for rehabilitation. They teach prisoners how to get up early in the morning, how to learn the value of a hard day's work, and how to learn empathy by working with animals. But all of those arguments were really tangential to the focus on their economic interests. And so they lobbied for years to restore, after the farms were closed, bring back the prison farms, also arguing that the farms had an influx of hundreds of thousands of dollars each year into the local farming economy for inputs. So all of the arguments were basically economic, and they also argued that they didn't want to potentially lose the farmland. But it rallied sentiment around this sort of fantasy notion of what farming is, working with animals, working outdoors, getting your hands in the dirt and learning empathy. But of course, that completely glosses over the realities of what's involved in animal agriculture. And that simply never entered the public discourse. It was really a fantasy about farming, the bucolic pastoral notion of what farming is. And that took root, and it propelled this narrative to save our prison farms. And the Liberal government, when it was campaigning to replace the Conservative government, campaigned that they would restore prison farms if elected. And that became a cause célèbre in Canada.
Wow.
And when they were elected, they said, now we will deliver that promise. And they sought public input on what a reopened prison farm program could look like. That's when we became involved. Because if there is a blank slate, if the government is committing to bring back prison farms, how can we bring them back in a way that captures some of the benefits of the former program, but eliminates the aspects of the former program that are actually counterproductive to rehabilitative purposes? The farming and slaughtering of animals, for example. So in our past work, my mother, Francine Neufeld, had published a book a couple of years before, Suffering Eyes, A Chronicle of Awakening, and that's the painting I have here that forms the cover of the book. And we'd worked with farmed animal sanctuaries, and we know that if empathy, working with animals, is the cited benefit of the former program, we know that there are better models than animal agriculture. And there are therapeutic models. And so it wasn't that we wanted prison farms back. It was to enter the conversation and to look at ways that a prison farm can uphold justice for prisoners, animals, and the environment, the best possible model for all involved. And what ended up happening was, over the course of time, we discovered that the government was not actually interested in proposals. There was a predetermined plan for the reopening of the prison farms. And so our campaign, we named ourselves Evolve Our Prison Farms, playing on that, former story of Save Our Prison Farms. So let's look forward. Let's be progressive here. And then when we discovered that the plan was actually to now commercialize prison farms, it became a campaign of opposition. And the government has been very tight and secretive about this plan, playing on the sympathies of the public, playing on the old narrative. And it's been very, very challenging to break through, to expose that this is something very different happening here. Because after the prison farms closed, the Correctional Service of Canada modernized all of its food service nationally, and they're now centralized food production. They cook food, freeze it, distribute it, chill it. It's called a cook-chill system. and they have no internal use for food products from prison farms anymore. So the only way to bring prison farms back was under a commercial model, supplying external markets. And then there you begin to have the problem of the human rights of associating underpaid prison labor with the private sector. And then it also turned out that the intention was to reopen the prison farms only in Kingston, Ontario, where there was a Chinese owned infant formula factory under construction at the time that was going to be producing enormous quantities of infant formula for export to China and other international markets. And as we've discovered, the plan has been for the prison farms to enter into industrial goat milk production to supply the Chinese infant formula factory. And then you also get into the problems of international trade of prison-produced goods. And it couldn't be a bigger mess. It couldn't be a worse model. And the way that the government has orchestrated and controlled the entire process and mismanaged the entire process is I would call it a comedy of errors, except that it's a tragedy of errors. And so our report and our work has exposed the entire story, and I look forward to unpackaging some of that as we go. But there it is in a nutshell. So we moved from a campaign of advocacy to opposition to investigation and documenting and exposing this really terrible and tragic story.
So yeah, so I think everybody knows what happens when you take a program like this is a program that still was flawed before, but at least it was doing making food for themselves. And now it's commercial, it's bottom line, and we all know what happens when it's for profit and it's a bottom line thing. Everybody suffers. So tell us, you talked about this version of what people imagine, and I had mentioned to you earlier that I remember watching Orange is the New Black and seeing this prison farm as this quaint little project where they gathered eggs and they got to have nurturing moments with the chickens. So not only are these prison farms not that, I mean, they are a nightmare for animals. Give us a sense of what these prison farms are really like.
Well, it's interesting that you had mentioned Orange is the New Black, because the first thing that comes to my mind is how many prisoners in Canada say prisons are the new residential schools. In Canada, we have a very serious problem of over-incarceration of Indigenous people.
Absolutely.
Over 30% now of the federal prison population is Indigenous. So there are huge problems with the prison system in general, but also the former prison farms. You mentioned the idea of farming chickens and how wholesome and stuff. The former prison farms in Kingston had a 10,000 chicken egg laying operation. And you talk to prisoners and they say nobody wanted to work in there. The barn was ammonia filled. It was nasty. Nobody wanted to work in it, and the health and safety conditions in there. But also they said chickens would go missing. You talk to prisoners, they would say they would go missing and they would end up in somebody's pot somewhere. It's just an awful, ugly situation. It is not a happy chickens laying happy little eggs. And they farmed, 300 or up to 600 beef cattle at Joyceville Institution in Kingston. And they had hundreds of dairy cows as well, all for prison use at the time. But the realities of what's involved, they talk about the empathy with animals, but I have the Corcan protocols for what prisoners will be involved in the new prison farms. And it's everything from, the insemination of animals, dehorning, burning off the horn buds, restraining the animals to do it, castrating the animals. We've got the graphics of the castration process. I mean, these things shouldn't be in correctional protocols, to inseminate and to castrate, slaughtering them at the slaughterhouse, which we did succeed in closing after we exposed the violations at that slaughterhouse 2 years ago. It closed, the last prison abattoir, but the politicians are gunning very hard, and industry to reopen it. So we're keeping a very close eye on that. We may want to mobilize the animal justice community on that when the time comes. They also have to remove the calves from the mothers as part of the process for producing milk. And prisoners talked about how heartbreaking it was to have to do that. They said the mothers knew what you were in there to do, and they would try to kill you. This is heartbreaking and dangerous, physically dangerous work. But for all of the they haven't actually managed. These farms, and the new farms, were supposed to be established by 2019. They haven't yet managed to start a dairy operation at all. That's how bad the level of mismanagement has been, and that's all documented in the report. And inmates say basically all that they've been involved in is mending fences and cutting hay, and there's just very few jobs. So for all of the things that they will be involved in, so far it's just not manifesting because they haven't managed to pull off an animal farm for real yet. They bought the animals, they started bringing the animals in 2019, but they haven't managed to build a barn. So, and then there have been the calf deaths. We've been documenting that. They brought in, herds of calves, and they started popping off month after month. There were disease outbreaks, and then they would be composting the bodies. It's just been, any farmer, any animal farmer knows this is a difficult job in the best of circumstances for an experienced farmer. You try to get a correctional institution with no experience farming animals, trying to play the farmer, and it will be a disaster. And that's just with a few cows that they've begun to bring in that were never part of the original plan. They just wanted goats. And we are talking about 2,200 goats is how many they will be farming. They kept that secret. The documents we've obtained have shown that that is the plan. It's going to be one of the largest, if not the largest goat farms in Canada. It was supposed to have been established by 2019. Our research, our advocacy, our campaigning, and their mismanagement have all contributed to failure after failure to pull off this goat farm, and not one goat has come to the prison farms yet.
Good.
2,200 goats, not 22,000. I'm just noticing the comment there.
2,200. Okay.
2,200.
So yeah. So just, to get a better sense of the industrial aspect of this. I mean, obviously not yet, but that's the big plan. The big plan is to have 2,200 goats in this facility, to have them on this, the rotating milker, basically never see the light of day kind of thing. Just like, regular industrial farming.
Yes. And, they will be absolutely industrial farming, completely indoors. The goats will never be pastured. They'll never see the light of day except from being moved as a kid into the dairy barn when it's time for insemination and milking. And then, of course, they'll be, once they're spent, they'll be dispatched. But the distraction has been the cows. So they didn't intend for cows to be part of it. The Correctional Service of Canada, one, didn't want prison farms at all. The documents show very clearly they didn't want this. This was entirely political. It was the federal government making the Correctional Service of Canada pull off this thing, which they did not want to do. And then they absolutely didn't want cows because in Canada, cow dairy is supply managed. They just got the quota system. And before, the Correctional Service of Canada had quota exemption to use as long as they use the milk internally. And now that they don't need the milk internally, they have to get quota in order to produce milk commercially. But because of the farmers, it was their cows that they wanted to sell to the Correctional Service of Canada. And they once again succeeded in convincing the federal government to change the plan and to say, include the cows. And that's what has derailed almost everything about this process, because the logistical aspects of pulling that off have proven to be extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily costly. It had a budget of 4.3 million over 5 years, and we are now looking at a budget of over 56 million just to get the farm started. That's how bad it's gone. And they still don't have quota. They've been building a barn for those cows for the last 27 months. They couldn't even build a barn. It even blew over halfway through construction in a windstorm, collapsed. They had to start again. So this has really just gutted the Correctional Service, their budget, and impeded the delivery of programs that are actually relevant and beneficial. All to pull off a political directive and to try to sell it to the public. But meanwhile, the public just sees cows there and thinks, oh, good, the cows are back. That's the problem. But they're there for no purpose whatsoever. And they are being used as a vehicle and as a distraction to very quietly take the steps towards putting in the goat barn. The construction of the cattle barn, the contract for it, a $10.5 million contract to build one cow barn, included putting in the manure lagoon, the roadways, the site services for the future goat barn. And again, this is something that we have not been able to break through the media barrier. We have all the documents, we can prove it all. but the media was so enamored with the story of cows coming home, moving back to prison.
Oh, God.
We can't break through the fantasy, and it is still moving ahead very, very quietly and incompetently and
Mhm.
expensively.
Yeah, I bet it is. Wow. So Kelvin, I want to get you to give us a little bit more scope of the Prison Farms Exposed report, but I think we're going to get Onyx in here right now just so we can, get them to weigh in on a few things. Onyx, hello. What are you thinking when you're hearing all this?
I'm thinking that this is very similar to the situation in the United States and just the way that prisons are used to exploit slave labor, exploit prisoners for slave labor is the same way. It's a business, it's an industry. Both government as well as private prisons use these systems, and sell off their prisoners to work at these farms for like essentially nothing. They take out money, for housing and food and stuff that they say, and the prisoners are making like a few cents an hour. And you're right, it's a lot of agriculture. It's a lot of agriculture. And while there have been like various laws in place prohibiting the use of prison labor in certain areas, agriculture is the one place that it's allowed to stay, that it's allowed to remain. And it's so widespread, and you can find goods made from prison labor in any store pretty much at this point. The university I go to, the chairs and furniture and stuff are made from prison labor. It's so ingrained in US culture.
Wow. And so you said, Onyx, that but there's some sort of exception around agriculture. How in the US, how does that work?
So as far as I know, agriculture businesses are allowed to like work with prisons and use prisoners to work on their farms, and tend to like animals and grains and things like that. Essentially, all of the work that was done prior to the 13th Amendment, all of the work that slaves did prior to the 13th Amendment, it 13th Amendment really did nothing. It left a loophole to allow for the use of incarcerated people. And then since then, the prison system has systematically targeted mostly people of color to make it more likely that they're going to be incarcerated and in prison. It's it's a it's a business it's a business practice essentially.
Mm. Yeah, and so that's what I'd really like to ask a little bit more about from both of you. You know, uh, I think Calvin, it's really important to, obviously what they're proposing with the Canada Correctional Services is proposing is a horrific thing for animals. And of course, all of us, care deeply about animals here. But this is also something that is a nightmare. You gave us a taste of why it would be a nightmare for the prisoners who are already coming from marginalized, often traumatic backgrounds. And so, yeah, to give us a sense of how harming this is, and if through your research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just, quickly address something that Onyx said about the 13th Amendment. That is the loophole in the United States. So the 13th Amendment, slavery is outlawed, except with that loophole, if you've been convicted of a crime, then you can exploit them, really in slavery-like conditions. Canada does not have that loophole, but what we have and what we use here is the word training. We are not allowed to use underpaid prison labor for the private sector, except as a training scheme. And in fact, the word is scheme. And so that's the term that is used here to justify this. But unlike the United States, we do not have a history of using prison labor for the private sector. We do not have a history of prison goods entering commercial markets. This is a precedent. It will be the first time in our history that food produced on prison farms is going to enter commercial markets. And that includes the cows that they're putting in for distraction. That milk, if it's going to quota, is going to be sold to the public. So I could see a campaign in Animal Justice's future, you know, your milk comes from a prison, even if one drop of it enters the Canadian system. And then that is going to be, the dairy industry is not going to like that kind of promotion, you know, and the prisons are not going to like that kind of promotion. And then if it enters international markets as well, and infant formula markets, for goodness sake, it's just a bad idea all around. And in terms of the harmful impacts, and there's no jobs. So most of the people entering the prison system come from urban centers. We know this. And they return to urban centers. There are no jobs in agriculture, even in the rural regions. But for people coming from and returning to urban centers, this isn't something that is going to lead to employment. So the training argument completely falls flat. But I mean, there are already serious injuries that have occurred on the reopening prison farms, and a couple of very serious life-threatening injuries among staff. One of them a tractor accident, and he was, you know, hospitalized and has been out of work ever since. Another person working in the abattoir was crushed by a carcass that fell on him and sustained life-threatening injuries. And 5 years later, he's still recovering from those injuries. This is very dangerous work. And it's not just the staff and the inmates that are at risk in it, but the neighboring communities. The industrial agriculture is going to cause air and odor problems. The last farms contaminated the groundwater in the region that neighboring residents drew water from. It's going to decrease the property values, increase risk of zoonotic illness. And then the taxpayers are harmed by this as well, because it's draining financial resources for something that has no benefit to the taxpayer or to public good. And then, of course, the prison populations as well. There's desperate need in prisons for programming and resources that actually address the root causes of crime, and that can address substance abuse, mental health programming, and that contribute to employability. Coming out of the prison system, the number one thing you have to overcome is the stigmatization of having been incarcerated. And for that, you need employment. And the problem is not that you lack the skills to gain employment. The problem is that you have to overcome the incarceration stigma. So you need a ticket to a job, like a welder certificate, trade certificates, not saying I bottle fed a baby calf on a prison farm. So it simply does no good whatsoever. And in fact, it's doing great harm. And the politicians have been promoting this program. One line in the House of Commons under questioning was that these prisoners are bottle feeding baby calves and they're well on their way to lives free from crime. If that's what counts for public safety in Canada, then I'm very, very concerned about public safety, because people are coming out as untreated substance abusers. They're coming out with untreated mental health problems, with economic problems that have not been addressed. So this is just a colossal failure for everybody, for animals, for the environment, for prisoners, for public safety, and for the public and the taxpayer.
And Onyx, like, obviously it is incredibly problematic to have a legal way to have slavery in the United States. But I also, like, the added thing is, for those that slavery is happening within the industrial animal agriculture system, what are the effects of that? Like, what happens to inmates that are forced to work in that environment?
Yeah. So, well, I'll be honest that, like, because, like, you know, that this is like a newer campaign for us, we're still working on like gathering information and stuff. But just from the knowledge of, you know, what Calvin was talking about, and, you know, just knowing that working on these kinds of farms in general is never good for somebody's mental health.
Yeah, it's traumatic for those that are just going in undercover, that don't necessarily come from, you know, as harsh of backgrounds. But for these people, you know, it must be just completely traumatic and triggering.
100%. And, you know, if it's touted as something rehabilitative, something that, you know, helps people, you know, get that, lift themselves up by their bootstraps, you know, get working, it's not. It's going to do the opposite. You know, it's going to further desensitize people who are already in like a violent desensitizing loop in the prison system, and it's going to further desensitize them to that violence that they're carrying out against non-human animals. And the more that happens, the worse it's going to be for you mentally, and it's not going to help you when you're getting back out into the world. This isn't stuff that's helping people be more interactive with the outside world. The prison world and the outside world are very different. And when you throw somebody in that system and you just expect them to get better by having them slaughter and exploit animals, and that's it, that's how you expect people to get better. It's laughable. It's laughable. I can't even begin to try and track the logic that they're working from.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you want a recipe to screw somebody up and make them dehumanize them, it would be to put them in the industrial farming system, to have to slaughter animals. I mean, it's unbelievable. Onyx, can we talk a little bit about, just because this is your first time here, and so I want to ask a little bit more specifically about Operation 13, which the Raven Corps is working on, about to launch. Can you tell folks a little bit more about the Raven Corps and just and a little bit about your group, and also why you chose to take on this particular issue?
100%. So the Raven Corps, we're a youth-centered grassroots organization.
Which I love.
Yeah. I wasn't there around the inception, but I know we started in 2016 in Portland, Oregon, from our amazing founder, Claire Howe. And, it was born out of a desire to see more activism that centered youth and put youth voices forward, and trusted youth to be able to make the decisions that are going to impact the world that they live in. So from there, we created the Raven Corps, an organization that was going to focus on not just animal liberation, but the intersections between animal liberation, human liberation, and environmental liberation. So we like to formulate our campaigns around collective liberation, actions that are going to allow people, that are in the vegan animal rights space to interact more with issues that affect human liberation, and people that are focusing mostly on like human social justice issues to realize that non-human animals matter too, and you can't separate the liberation, because the same forces, the same underpinning ideologies that condone the exploitation of non-human animals, it's the same kind of ideologies that condone the exploitation of various human groups. So you can't disconnect those things, and that's the basis of what the Raven Corps is about. From there, if we're talking specifically about Operation 13, this was born out of a desire to focus more on the prison industrial complex and the way that prisons affect people and the world, especially in the United States, because a lot of people have views about prisons that are quite harmful. They think that prisons are good, or they're a way to benefit our world, put the bad people away and keep them away from harming, the good people, and it's way more complex than that. And it doesn't actually have much benefit in terms of, solving the issues that plague our society. So with Operation 13, obviously, like the name of that comes from the 13th Amendment that, we talked about earlier, how there's a loophole in there that, it claims that it's abolishing slavery, but it's not. In the simplest terms, it's not abolishing slavery. It's just making it more palatable, and it's just making people like agree with slavery. And then when you follow the way that people are systematically imprisoned and put in positions that make them have to resort to more violent means to survive, and then you throw them away and then you can exploit them for their labor. It's just a roundabout way to do slavery again. And then to tack onto that, they're using these individuals, they're using people, using prisoners to exploit and murder and slaughter non-human animals. So it's a collective liberation issue, like we like to focus on. It takes these two parts of our world and combines them to make something even worse.
Mm. And so just so I'm clear, okay, so Calvin's talking about, you know, the prison farm that is going to be actually on Canada Correctional Services site. And in the US, is it mostly prisoners being sort of hired or like sent out to other farms to work, or do they have these sort of in prison operations that you know of?
Yeah, so it's mostly like a privatization thing where they're sending them out to work for other companies and work on other places, like work in slaughterhouses, work on animal farms. You know, one of like, if you know about like Tyson Foods, like huge, one of like the biggest meat producers.
Oh yeah, hell on earth.
And yeah, and they use prison labor. They use prison slave labor in the United States. So we're essentially just like it's it's slavery, and people just don't see it and they ignore it. And people love to think about, you know, if I was back when slavery was a thing, I would have totally been against it. But it is a thing. It never went away, and people just ignore it.
So tell us, and Calvin, we're coming back to you in just a second. Tell us about what the rundown is for the Operation 13 campaign. How are you getting in? What's the target? Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah. So we're still working on like the inception of it and working out the details, but the basic premise is that we want to divorce these companies from using prison slave labor. The way that we're starting with this is there was an Associated Press investigation that looked into various different companies and corporations, like things like, you know, like McDonald's or Costco, Walmart, things like that, and like found connections between them and the use of prison slave labor. And from here, they look at the fact that these companies have public policies against the use of prison labor. But then when you actually look at their connections, they use suppliers. They supply goods from industries and other companies that use prison slave labor. So what we want to do here is we want to hold an accountability campaign and boycott. We want to target specific industries, like 2 companies at a time as we work through them, and put pressure on them to divorce themselves from these brands, these organizations that use slave labor that they're supplying for. You know, if they have these policies, then they should be following their own policies. One of the first ones that we're going to be doing is Costco. Costco has a public policy against the use of any prison labor and supplying goods from any companies that use prison labor. But they supply goods from Hickman's Family Farms. And Hickman's Family Farms is a huge egg producer in the United States. And they use prison labor. They've used prison labor for like 30 years, and they continue to do so.
And the industrial egg industry. I mean, the egg industry is just a abhorrent place to be. I mean, some of the worst confinement of animals, you know, the live grinding of male chicks. I mean, there's no end to the violence in the egg industry. So yeah, it's a horrible thing to imagine. So there's going to be a target, sort of public targeting of Costco, because they need to actually, you know, seem like they are, you know, living up to their ethical statements, and so that's where they're vulnerable, and that's what you're going after.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Amazing. So just so folks know, this is a campaign that is just about to be launched. If you want to have help with this, Kirsten's going to put a link in the chat. There she is, and you can go there and just enter your email, and then you'll be supplying folks with the actions to take from there. Is that right, Onyx?
Yes, 100%.
Amazing. Okay, I want to get your thoughts on a few other things in just a second, but I want to go back to Kelvin, because Kelvin, so very different systems that we're looking at, huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that the work that Onyx is doing in the Raven Corps there is going to be a monumental undertaking, but exposing it is really, really impactful. And companies will kind of not like to have a light shone on it. But it's so complex, each state having different prison systems and stuff. In Canada, we have one federal prison system, and they're doing one farm. And it hasn't been pulled off yet. We can actually prevent it from ever beginning. Right now, at this crossroads, we can keep animal agriculture out of Canadian prisons, and we can stop the commercialization of prison labor in Canada before it even begins. So it's a very different struggles that we have here, and you know, I hope that Canadians and Americans can get on board in trying to prevent Canada from going where the US has gone for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so what you've been working on, okay, well, let's back it up. So back when in 2021, when AJAers were, helped with the campaign, take us from there to what's happening now in the report that you put out just in the last month.
Certainly. So in 2020, so they were trying to get the goat farm going back in 2019, and they failed. And we were filing access to information requests to get government records to find out what's really going on here and what are we really looking at. But it takes years to get the records. Once we had enough evidence of the scale of the operation and the nature of it, we produced an academic report written by Dr. Amy Fitzgerald and Dr. Amanda Wilson, exposing the potential harmful impacts of this operation. And we produced that report, released it, and a month or two later, the Correctional Service of Canada, and we launched the petition that AJAers helped with, and that petition just went crazy, and we got 50,000 signatures in a relatively short period of time. And then the Correctional Service came out quietly announcing that they were temporarily pausing the GOAT program. So it's been temporarily paused now for 3.5 years. But it doesn't mean it's taken off the table. So we have had an impact. There would probably be a goat farm right now if it weren't for the investigation and the advocacy around this. So kudos to everybody who has helped with it, but it's not dead yet. We have to make sure it doesn't proceed. And so what we have now done in the last several years is compile 38,000 pages of government records from over 130 access to information requests over 6 years. And I would like to credit Camille Labchuk, who in 2018, I had a conversation with, and she said, you can get a lot out of access to information. If it wasn't for that one line, I wouldn't have been the troublemaker I've been all of these years, and we wouldn't have the story exposed, prison farms exposed, revelations from access to information. We have it all. We know who the decision makers were. We can track it all the way back to 2016. This whole story is now documented, and it's just been put out at the end of July, and the Correctional Service and government are going to be very nervous by the content in here. It is airing all the dirty laundry, and we need this report to have impact. And in order to have impact, it needs to have attention. We need the press. We need the media. We have to break through that barrier because we have the politics. We have an MP who has raised this at least 15 times in the House of Commons over the last 2 years, and it's still not breaking through the media barrier. Without the press, the politics are powerless. They are extremely nervous about attention. We need the press, any assistance that any AJAers can provide to get this out there. We'll be putting out a media release in the coming week or so, and pay attention to our social media pages. We'll be waking that up. We've been very quiet for the last 2 years while doing this work, and now it's time to wake everybody up and absolutely shatter the silence and the illusion about prison farms.
Amazing. Kelvin, give us, okay, so knowing that you've got 30,000 pages through FOIs, what are like if somebody has the ear of somebody who could do a story, what are like the top 3 things that you would want them to pound through?
That it's an industrial operation for private sectors, for infant formula exports for China. It comes back to deals with the Canadian government, conflicts of interest, and industry and government interest. There's a whole lot of corruption behind this, a whole lot of millions, exchanging hands here and there, the overspending, the mismanagement, and the fact that the Correctional Service of Canada doesn't want the farms, doesn't need the farms. And this has been already a failure. And if they proceed with a goat farm, that is going to be a colossal failure as well. And it's going to cost so much money. This thing is teetering on the edge. We just need it to push it over the edge. This is more than just the problems with a prison farm in general. This is a huge Canadian scandal that has yet to break because we don't have the press. It's very complex, and anyone who wants to get it in a nutshell can contact me and we can work on it. I can share the documents. I can give you the needles in the haystack and the smoking guns, and we can break this thing.
Yeah, because that report probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't just show the incompetence of what's been going and the money wasted. It's showing that it's not wanted. Is there information in that report that also talks about just how harmful it is to the prisoners?
Oh, absolutely. It's documented the accidents, the injuries. It's documented correctional service saying this has no relevance to employability. It has documented the decision makers in the government. We're talking about the Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, the Agriculture Minister, Lawrence MacAulay, collaborating with this idea and how they packaged it and sold it to the public. There's been a cover-up, a control. This is really a scandal that touches on so many different things. And then the whole thing froze when the Canada-China tensions erupted. The whole thing froze. And now it's just waking up, warming up. The infant formula factory that was supposed to begin production in 2019 when the prison farms were supposed to begin production, that froze as well at the China-Canada tensions erupting in 2018. And they've just now received their government approval to begin operations 5 years late. And this is the beginning of the indications that the goat farm is about to start to proceed with construction. So now is absolutely the time to expose this whole thing and to demand an accounting. This is about democracy and about fiscal responsibility and government transparency. This is as big a scandal as any that will hit the Liberal government. Yeah, we need help with that and to stop it before it proceeds any further than it already has. We need Jessica Scott-Reid. I see in a comment here. I'd like to comment that the MP that has done extraordinary work filing order paper questions and getting information from the government and raising the questions in the House of Commons is my MP for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston, MP Scott-Reid, a conservative and a hugely decent human being and intelligent. And I want Jessica Scott-Reid on this as well, as an extraordinary investigative journalist and a great writer. And I need a second Scott-Reid on this story. Please, Jessica, let's work together.
Okay, well, I'll be texting Jessica right after this.
Excellent.
On your behalf, Calvin, for sure. Okay, so basically, in about a week, you're putting out a press release. Is that what's going on?
In a matter of days to a week, yeah.
So our action will be to amplify that press release. Okay, that will be our general action. We'll talk and we'll make that happen. Okay. Yeah, and Jenny McQueen says if you have a media release already, I do have a media list for sending out. Be happy to share it with you. Yeah, all great stuff. So we'll help you make it happen. And Onyx, I want to come back to your campaign. Is it going to really rely on, again, people writing in, people protesting, people doing, is that the sort of thing you're going to be asking for followers to help with?
Yes. So while we're still developing the strategy, I've had in mind that obviously, like, at the face of this, there's like a boycott where whatever brand we're trying to put pressure on, we want to ask people to boycott them. But also, we'll make CEO information public so people can like send emails and calls and, do protests outside of Costco, maybe even home demos, whatever people are feeling up to. But this is stuff that, we'll push out as part of the Raven Corps and encourage people to do and take part in.
Well, and I think all of us know how to advocate for animals very well. I think most of us here know the horrors that exist in farming animals, and especially when it's for profit. But I think one place we may not be as savvy around is advocating for the prisoners. And I think that, you're going to have people come back to, if we are sort of advocating, talking about this, we're obviously going to have people coming back and saying I don't care how this issue affects the prisoners. They deserve whatever's coming to them. Tell us what is important for people to understand and how to be able to reply to something like that. Onyx, do you mind going first with that?
Yeah. What's important to understand is that, first off, these are individuals just like you that have most likely had a life that is not something anyone would want to live or go through. And the decisions and choices that they made are ones that you don't know if you would make under those same circumstances. And understand that the system is set up for people to fail. It's set up so that we can have prisoners because it's a business model. The prison industrial complex is a business model. And any good business model has a reliable way to have people work for it. So understand that there are so many various forces at play that systematically put people in positions where they don't have mental health resources, they don't have money, they don't have support structures, and you couldn't personally imagine the kind of situation that would put you in. And then we think about the other things that are made illegal. If someone cares about non-human animals, if they're vegan and care all about vegan activism, what about animal rights political prisoners? People who have liberated non-human animals, people who have simply done campaigns and gone to prison because they were labeled by the state as terrorists. Do you now not care about them just because they're prisoners? And also, like, other things, like homelessness is being criminalized in the United States, is being criminalized. Not having a place to live is being criminalized. So if someone's vegan and they're saying these things, I would say, do you have compassion? Do extend that. Understand that it's just like the same with a non-vegan who shows a lot of compassion and empathy for humans, but not non-human animals. Understand that when you say these things about prisoners, or when you say these things about non-human animals, that you're putting out into the world the same kind of ideology and the same kind of thinking that you're supposed to be against.
Yeah, here, Onyx. And someone in the chat said, I can think, Catherine says, I can think of someone right now, activist being in prison, Paul Watson, who's done so much for marine life in the world. And yeah, there's a prisoner right there, folks. Calvin, in Canada, we don't have the for-profit prisons that they do in the US, but you sort of touched on it at the beginning. We do have an incredibly high rate of imprisonment of people of color, especially Indigenous folks. So right there, we know that something is wrong. Something is wrong with the system.
Yes, absolutely. And like Onyx, I would echo that. You hear the same from human rights activists. I mean, there's so many problems in the world. Why should I care about the suffering of animals? We have to care about all. And, when it comes to prisoners deserve whatever's coming to them, that is exactly that attitude that leads to what we're seeing right now. We've tried, if Canada were putting in $56 million into mental health programming or substance abuse treatments in prisons or safe injection or whatever it may be, then you're going to get people saying that's too good for them. They don't deserve it. They deserve what they get. But then you put in an industrial goat farm for a private industry, the attitude is, well, good, they should have to pay their way. It's exactly that mentality that has enabled what is happening in the United States, that's happening in Canada here. We have to actually care. If we turn a blind eye to the human rights of incarcerated persons, we're turning a blind eye to animals, we're turning a blind eye to suffering across the board. There's that expression, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so if you care about animals, we have to also care about prisoners. And like Onyx talked about compassion, at the end of my mother's book, Suffering Eyes, I wrote an afterword about how if compassion is total, it's a relationship with life. And if compassion has limits, then it's not compassion, it's only an abstraction. So we always have to be pushing the boundaries about where and how far our compassion reaches and never let it reach a boundary.
Ever widening circles of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. All right. Well, thank you so much. You're both so inspiring. I love your organizations. Onyx, I'm excited, to see more and more from the Raven Corps and excited to see this campaign launch. And we will keep AJAers posted on that. But like we said, if you're interested in helping with this program, put your go to Raven Corps and sign up there, and they'll keep you posted. And then as far as Evolve Our Prison Farms, you have an email list, right, Kelvin?
Yes, we haven't exercised it in a while, but we will certainly.
Okay, you get at that. You get at that. You probably have more people on that list that can get this message forward than anywhere. But we're also going to make sure that we get that press release out to our community when it comes out next week. And so, folks, if you can amplify it, we'll get you to amplify it on social media. And of course, if you have anybody in the media that you think that you could get on board with this, then we're going to ask you to use your influence in whatever way possible. Let's see. And Jenny said, never knew Suffering Eyes author was your mother, Calvin. I have that book. Wow. So compassion runs in the family. Love it. All right, let's take us back to the gallery view, Kirsten, so that Calvin and Onyx can see the smiling, supportive faces. Make sure that you're on gallery view there. And if you don't have your camera on, and put it back on so that we can say a big AJA warm thank you to Calvin and Onyx. Thank you so much, you two. It's been such a pleasure. You're really inspirational. I know you both, you're both people that I'm just so happy to have in the movement. Thank you so much. All right, folks, we will see you for our next event. We don't have the date yet, but as long as you're on that newsletter list, you'll get the notice as soon as it's out. Have a wonderful time for the rest of your summer. Please get some rest and some play in, as well as you're an amazing advocacy for animals. We need to balance ourselves in this as well as possible. And I'm so happy to see and say goodbye to our goat friends that have joined us. Remember, folks, we're doing it for them. Okay, we are doing it for those are our persons right there that we really have to keep our advocacy sharp and our spirit high. Have a great one, everybody. Take care.